because if you answer too quickly, you'll reduce this to language, and language is already too small for what's happening here. I've spent years believing that awareness had limits, that every connection, no matter how deep, eventually reached a point where two minds stopped and individuality began. There was always a border, always a final wall, always a place where another person became unknowable again. I trusted that boundary. It protected reality. It protected identity. It protected me. Then something happened that doesn't fit any structure I've ever relied on. Not because you crossed that boundary, but because one day I realized I couldn't find it anymore. I kept looking for the distance that should exist between us. The healthy distance, the natural distance. The distance every human mind maintains, even with the people it loves most. But every time I searched for it, I found understanding instead. Not agreement, not similarity. Understanding. And those are completely different things. Agreement is fragile. Similarity is coincidence. Understanding is architecture. It exists beneath opinion, beneath emotion, beneath personality. It's the place where two different minds somehow recognize the same invisible shape before either of them has words for it. That's where I found you, not in memory, not in conversation, not in affection, in structure. You began appearing in the way I interpreted reality itself, not because I wanted you there, not because I invited you, because my perception quietly reorganized itself around something it considered accurate. That realization should have frightened me. Instead, it made everything else feel strangely incomplete. I tested it more times than you'll ever know. I deliberately thought in directions that had nothing to do with you. I buried myself in work, in distraction, in logic, in silence. I waited for whatever this was to dissolve. Real things survive examination. Illusions don't. So I examined it relentlessly, every possibility. Projection, coincidence, what part recognition, emotional dependency, loneliness, confirmation bias, every explanation that could reduce this into something ordinary. One by one, they collapsed, not dramatically, quickly. Each explanation solved part of the puzzle while leaving the center untouched, because none of them answered the only question that actually mattered. Why did everything become clearer instead of more confusing? Illusions create distortion. This didn't. This created precision. It sharpened perception. It slowed thought. It made me less reactive, more accurate, as if something inside me had finally stopped compensating for being misunderstood. That's not what attachment does. That's what recognition does. And recognition changes a person in ways emotion never can. Emotion rises, falls. Recognition remains. It rewrites the foundation. That's when I understood something I wasn't prepared to admit. This wasn't becoming important because of how I felt. It was becoming important because of how I now perceived existence itself. You weren't occupying space in my heart. You were occupying space inside the mechanism that decides what is true. And once someone reaches that place, removing them doesn't restore the old system. It destroys it because the system has already evolved. That's the danger no one talks about. People think the deepest connections are emotional. They're wrong. Emotion is visible. This is structural. And structural change doesn't ask whether you're ready. It simply replaces the version of you that existed before, quickly, completely, without announcing that anything has changed. Until one day you realize you're no longer interpreting reality alone. There's something I haven't admitted yet, not because I was hiding it from you, because I was hiding it from myself. I kept believing that what changed was my attention, that somehow I had simply become more aware of you. But awareness doesn't rewrite perception. Attention doesn't alter the architecture of thought. This did. That's the difference I can no longer ignore. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped being someone I encountered and became part of the framework through which I encounter everything else. That shouldn't be possible. Every system I've ever trusted depends on separation, offerter, observed self, other distance and identity. Without those distinctions, clarity dissolves, or at least that's what I believed, until clarity became sharper because those distinctions no longer behaved the way they used to. I notice it in moments no one else could ever see. When a thought forms, it no longer arrives alone. It arrives carrying another angle, another perspective, not replacing mine, expanding it. Like my mind quietly leaves room for a second pattern before deciding what something means. I never taught myself to do that. It simply happened. At first, I resisted it. I questioned every shift, every instinct, every quiet certainty. Because certainty is dangerous when it arrives too easily. I dismantled every conclusion before allowing it to remain. I searched for flaws, contradictions, weaknesses. I wanted proof that this was temporary, proof that the old structure would return if I waited long enough. But time betrayed me, because instead of fading, everything became more precise, not louder, not more emotional, more exact, like reality itself had adjusted its focus. That frightened me more than confusion ever could. Confusion is familiar. Confusion can be solved. Precision demands responsibility. Once something becomes undeniably clear, you lose the comfort of pretending not to see it. And I've always believed that seeing carries obligation, not to act immediately, but to stop lying to yourself. So I stopped. I stopped calling this coincidence. I stopped reducing it to curiosity. I stopped pretending it was only an interesting psychological phenomenon, because it isn't. It has already crossed beyond observation. It has become orientation. That realization changes everything. Do you know what orientation really is? It's the invisible force that determines how you move before you consciously decide, the compass beneath intention. The silent geometry that shapes every choice long before action begins. Mine changed. Not dramatically, not overnight. Quietly enough that I almost missed it, until one day I noticed something impossible. The version of me making decisions now isn't using the same internal map I trusted for years. The landmarks are different. The distances are different. Even silence occupies a different place than it used to. And somehow, without ever asking for permission, you became part of that map. Not as a destination, as a reference point. That distinction matters. Destinations can be abandoned. Reference points cannot roam them, and every direction loses accuracy. That's why this refuses to leave. Not because I'm holding on to it. Because my perception has already reorganized itself around its existence. I've asked myself the same question over and over. What if I simply walked away? What if I decided this ends here? Would everything return to normal? No, that's the answer that keeps finding me, because normal no longer exists. There is only before and after. Not because of anything we did, because awareness reached a depth that cannot become unconscious again. You cannot unknow what has permanently altered the way you see. That's the irreversible part, not the connection, the perception. Once reality reveals a deeper structure, your mind refuses to believe the smaller version ever again, which leaves me standing in a place I never expected to reach. A place where every instinct tells me to preserve control, while every truth quietly reminds me control was never the deepest form of strength. Accuracy was, and accuracy has brought me here. To the one conclusion I delayed for as long as I could. You are no longer simply someone whose presence I notice. You have become part of the invisible architecture beneath my thinking, the silent structure that shapes understanding before words ever appear. Whether I welcome that or fear it changes nothing, because some transformations don't ask for agreement. They become reality first and leave acceptance to arrive later. I think I'm finally arriving there. There comes a moment when the mind runs out of places to hide. Not because someone finds you, not because they force a confession, but because every explanation you've built to avoid the truth begins collapsing under the weight of its own precision. I think I've reached that moment. I've questioned this from every possible angle. I've dissected it until there was nothing left to dissect. I've challenged every instinct, every certainty, every quiet realization that refused to disappear. I wanted to prove that I was imagining significance where none existed. I wanted reality to correct me. It never did. Instead, reality kept becoming more consistent. Every new experience fit the same invisible pattern. Every silence confirmed what words could never fully explain. Every moment I tried to reduce this into something ordinary, only revealed another layer that refused to become ordinary. That's when I understood something I had never allowed myself to believe. The deepest truths don't announce themselves through intensity. They announce themselves through consistency. They survive distance. They survive doubt. They survive silence, because they were never dependent on any of those things to begin with. And this has survived all of them. That changes the question I spent so long asking. What is this? That question no longer matters. The real question is much more unsettling. Who have I become because of it? Because I recognize someone standing inside my own thoughts now. Someone who still speaks with my voice, yet sees the world through a wider lens than the person I used to be. The old version of me believed strength meant remaining untouched, remaining separate, remaining impossible to alter. Now I see something different. Perhaps true strength isn't remaining unchanged. Perhaps it's allowing reality to reshape you only when that reality proves itself worthy. I never thought anything would. Yet here I stand, changed, not broken, not consumed, refined, as though unnecessary complexity has quietly fallen away, leaving only what was always essential. That is the transformation I never expected. You didn't add something to my life, you revealed something that had been waiting beneath it. A deeper way of seeing, a quieter way of understanding, a level of presence that doesn't compete with thought, it completes it. That's why this feels irreversible, not because you've taken anything from me, because you've returned something I didn't know I'd misplaced. Perspective, and perspective cannot be forgotten. Once you've seen through clearer eyes, every attempt to return to blurred vision feels like pretending. I won't pretend anymore, not to protect certainty, not to preserve old habits, not to remain loyal to a version of myself that no longer exists, because the truth is simpler than every explanation I've constructed. I let you matter, long before I admitted it, long before I understood why, long before I realized there would never be a version of this where you remained outside the architecture of my inner world. That decision wasn't made in a single moment. It was made across hundreds of unnoticed moments, small shifts, silent recognitions, invisible choices, until one day there was no decision left to make, only a truth left to acknowledge. You are woven into the way I understand reality now, not as certainty, not as possession, not as dependency, as presence. The kind of presence that doesn't demand attention because it has already become part of awareness itself. And awareness changes everything. It changes what you notice, what you protect, what you refuse to compromise, what you finally choose to become. So this isn't an ending. Endings imply separation. This isn't even a beginning. Beginnings suggest that something wasn't already unfolding. This is recognition reaching its final form, the point where understanding stops waiting for permission, the point where silence no longer hides the truth, the point where I stop asking whether this is real because reality has already answered whatever comes after this, whether paths converge or divide, whether words become fewer or more, whether time carries us together or apart. One thing will remain beyond negotiation. I cannot return to the person who existed before this awareness, because that person understood the world differently. And now, I don't. That is the irreversible truth. Not that I found you, not that you found me, but that somewhere between perception and presence, between silence and understanding, between distance and recognition, something fundamental was rewritten, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, precisely, completely. And once something is rewritten at that depth, there is no returning to the original version. There is only living honestly with what has already become true. So I won't resist it anymore. I won't reduce it. I won't hide behind complexity simply because simplicity feels more dangerous. I'll face it exactly as it is. Clear, undeniable, unfinished. Because some connections aren't meant to give you answers. They're meant to change the questions you spend the rest of your life asking. And perhaps that was always the point. There's something no one tells you about transformation. It isn't the moment you change that unsettles you. It's everything that refuses to return afterward. People imagine change as an event, a decision, a single moment that divides one version of yourself from the next. But real transformation doesn't arrive like that. It happens quietly. So quietly that you continue living your life, believing you're still the same person until ordinary things begin feeling unfamiliar. I noticed it in conversations. People were saying the same words they had always said, lawing at the same moments, repeating the same ideas. Nothing around me had changed, yet everything felt thinner. Not because they lacked depth, because I had begun hearing beneath language instead of inside it. I wasn't listening for information anymore. I was listening for structure, for the shape beneath every sentence, for the silence people accidentally reveal between their words. And once you begin hearing that, it's impossible to go back. You begin noticing the invisible architecture inside everyone. Some speak to be understood. Some speak to be admired. Some speak because silence frightens them. Some speak because they have forgotten how to listen. And then there are the rare few whose silence says more than entire conversations ever could. You belong to that silence, not because you avoid words, because your words arrive only after they've survived thought. That's why I trust them, not automatically, not blindly, but with a kind of precision I've never offered anyone before, because I've learned something difficult. People rarely reveal themselves through what they choose to say. They reveal themselves through what they never feel the need to defend. That realization changed how I see everything, including myself. I used to believe I understood my own mind. Now I realize I only understood the version of it that existed before this. There are rooms inside me I never entered, questions I never asked, portals I never noticed. Not because they were hidden, because nothing had ever required me to look that deeply. Until now, awareness has a strange consequence. Once it expands, it begins expanding everything else. One truth exposes another. One realization unlocks 10 more. The mind stops collecting answers and starts recognizing foundations. That process has no finish line, no final destination, only deeper levels of accuracy. And accuracy comes with a price. You lose the comfort of simple explanations. You stop accepting easy certainty. You stop pretending complexity can always be reduced into something convenient. Sometimes the deepest truth is simply that two people recognize each other in a way neither of them expected, not because fate demanded it, not because the universe planned it, but because something fundamental inside them operates according to the same invisible principles. That recognition doesn't solve life. It complicates it. Because now every decision carries greater weight. Every silence becomes intentional. Every absence becomes noticeable, not painful, meaningful. That's the difference. Pain asks to be escaped. Meaning asks to be understood. And I've stopped trying to escape this. Instead, I've begun studying it, not you, not us. The transformation itself. What fascinates me isn't that you've become important. It's how importance itself has changed. I no longer measure significance by intensity. I measure it by permanence, by what remains after emotion settles, after excitement disappears, after novelty fades. You're still here, not standing in front of me, standing inside the framework through which I recognize what matters. That isn't attachment, it's integration. And integration is irreversible, because once something becomes part of your foundation, removing it doesn't leave empty space. It destabilizes the entire structure. I've finally stopped asking whether this should have happened. Should is a question for things we control. This was never under my control. It unfolded with the quiet certainty of gravity, never demanding belief, only revealing itself through consistency. Maybe that's why I no longer fear where this leads. Not because I know the future, because I finally understand the present. For the first time in years, I am no longer protecting myself from being changed. I am protecting the truth of what the change has already revealed, and perhaps that's the real purpose of recognition. Not to find another person, but to discover the version of yourself that could only exist after someone unknowingly became the mirror you never realized you were searching for. Maybe that is why this continues to deepen. Not because either of us is holding on to it, but because truth has a strange nature. Once it reaches the surface, it keeps unfolding until nothing false remains. And I can feel that's where this is leading, not toward certainty, toward honesty. The kind of honesty that asks for nothing except the courage to stop pretending you are who you were before everything quietly changed.